Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Pop with Corn. I'm here joined with Jack.
Howdy. Yeah, my name is Jack Collis. I am a former researcher at the LBJ School, which is a public policy school. I studied economics and ecology, but found that I was being trained to work in the professional managerial class, and I am now independent researcher working part-time and self-funding. I'm currently working on a YouTube series on left-wing political philosophy, economics, things like that. And yeah, I guess I'm here today to mostly talk about accelerationism. You expressed interest in the interview that last, I guess 2 weeks ago, I did an interview with Cooper Cherry on Machinic Unconscious Happy Hour. So I talked a little bit about Nick Land, Mark Fisher, and the kind of birth of accelerationism as a general philosophy and left accelerationism as a specific philosophy. So I'm more than happy to go a little deeper into that today.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I'm definitely excited to get a little bit more into that, especially Mark Fisher, just because he doesn't get as much. Well, he did, and he still does. He gets some decent attention, but it seems like
I think a lot of his critical theory is like popular. You know, Capitalist Realism, I think everyone acknowledges as a general opus of like the critical theory genre and the like Jameson Zizek tradition, but he's got a lot of other really good stuff as well that I think is slept on.
Definitely. And then real quick, just before I forget, I also want to mention that David Cavada is here in the room with us.
Hey everyone.
And he will also be chiming in from time to time. But I guess we can just really get into kind of Mark Fisher's work just right off the bat. And then especially how it pertains to like the political landscape. Because you did mention how a lot of his work tends to be more on like the critical theory side. And it seems like what's her name? Alex Cernicek. Am I saying that right?
So Alex Williams is
oh no, Alex Williams.
Nick Cernicek or Cernicek. I don't exactly. I don't know, and I don't feel like I'm gonna get it right.
Yeah, no. Yeah. He has a weird Nick. Is it? Yeah, Nick Cernicek. He has a weird last name, but I digress. They seem to have picked up the left accelerationist mantle after Mark Fisher's.
Yeah, I would say that Mark Fisher is definitely a theorist of kind of stagnation. He kind of talks a lot about how neoliberalism has produced kind of cultural as well as economic stagnation. I think he's very interested in the economic side of things, but he kind of narrows in on culture as a specific manifestation of how these things have slowed down. So like in Acid Communism, he kind of highlights how the neoliberal project was kind of marshaled to suppress these, revolutionary kind of blossomings that were enabled by the, strong welfare state, the Keynesian consensus. Neoliberalism kind of was in officially targeting those kind of welfare states, social security nets, but unofficially, he argues, targeted those kind of genuine threats to capitalism that emerged out of that era. So yeah, I think that he kind of focuses on how things have begun to, the accelerationist kind of tendency that Land wrote about in the 90s, he happened to be, it seems, on the tail end of, and in many ways...
Oh, I think you're flatlining.
Leveling off of those kind of radical, explosive tendencies.
Sorry, can you repeat what you said? You flatlined for a little bit.
Oh, yeah. So, he kind of theorizes neoliberalism as a flatlining of that kind of explosive accelerationist tendency that Land talks about in the 90s. It seems that Land was kind of on the tail end of that trend and kind of maybe saw something that was no longer happening just as it was beginning to
come to an end. Or
exactly, yeah. So like in things like Capitalist Realism, in this great essay called The Slow Cancellation of the Future, and Acid Communism, Fisher talks about just how this kind of stagnation is expressed in cultural terms. He gives examples like Amy Winehouse and the Arctic Monkeys as kind of revisiting and digging up old styles from the 60s and 80s rather than creating new culture. So he kind of viewed the general trend of capitalist techno-economic stagnation as it manifested itself in a stagnating culture.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then how do you think, because I know his work, Acid Communism, at least in certain ways that you can interpret that work, because for those of you who don't know, Mark Fisher, how would I say it? He passed away in 2017. He committed suicide.
Suicide in early 2017. Acid Communism was very much kind of, I think, the first attempts at him to kind of elaborate a positive aspect, whereas, Capitalist Realism is really just a bleak, sober look at how,
that like managerial aesthetic or oppression.
The hollowing out of, I guess it's the hollowing out of the public sphere is kind of, I think, the central thrust of it. Mm-hmm. The infiltration of what he calls business ontology into everyday life, kind of this mindset that everything should be run like a business. He talks about a number of things, and he also talks about the ways that a lot of the movements he talks about in Acid Communism in the 60s and 70s, especially the hippie movement, were co-opted by capitalism to create this neoliberal individualism that I think has proliferated and is kind of seen as the main mode of subjectivity under capitalism these days. Yeah.
I have two real quick questions for you. First, how did you become familiar with Mark Fisher's work? Because I know everyone has kind of like a different story. Some people say that it's like the vampire exit from the vampire castle.
Sorry, you asked how I became acquainted with Fisher?
Oh, yeah, with like his work.
I think from Rev Left Radio. I kind of, in the aftermath of 2016, before, Bernie came along, I would have considered myself a very surface level, I guess, libertarian transhumanist, I guess. I thought Elon Musk was really cool, and I guess I had no real concrete politics besides what I had kind of, I was dissatisfied with the left-right political spectrum as it existed in this country. And when Bernie came along, I guess the idea of socialism, kind of started to click. And after 2016, I kind of threw myself into researching, all these authors. And I started kind of with a more libertarian socialist, on the libertarian socialist side of things, with like authors like Murray Bookchin and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And I'd say that off the bat, I was very interested in economics, but over time I've gotten a little more interested in, the critical theory philosophy side of things. And in the, past year, I would say that has, very much narrowed in on post-structuralism, Deleuze, Guattari, and their kind of intellectual descendants in the form of Land, Fisher, and I guess I would consider Sun Chicken Williams kind of part of that continued lineage. I think that Fisher stood out as someone who kind of, whereas, Deleuze and Guattari and Land are almost like unreadable half the time, Fisher spoke in very, clear, sober terms and described things that I feel kind of are pretty universal to the experience of subjectivity under late capitalism. I think, he
I think he's flatlining again.
Really pinpoints these feelings of kind of emptiness in consumer culture. Yeah.
Okay. You flatlined for a little bit, but I think I got most of what you said. I was going to mention briefly, have you taken a chance to look at his essay, Good for Nothing?
The name sounds familiar. That's one of the ones where he talks about his depression, right?
Mm-hmm. And in that one where he talks about how he doesn't like thinking about things like depression, for example, in like from a too like subjective framework. But at the same time, the personal can become the impersonal, or a way to kind of politicize.
Yeah, I think he kind of, he definitely started off probably a lot more influenced by Deleuze and Guattari. That land, they were all very influenced by Deleuze and Guattari, and this is like one of their main ideas that they advance, is that these mental illnesses, and their whole critique is of psychoanalysis as kind of reifying mental illnesses as things of themselves, I guess, the Kantian term.
Mm-hmm.
They kind of don't look critically at what causes these mental illnesses. And in Capitalist Realism, Mark has a really good turn of phrase where he says that these kind of diseases have been chemico-biologized, so that social aspect of what causes them is completely ignored in favor of a chemical biological reading of depression, schizophrenia, what have you. But he also mentions that there are reasons that we lack serotonin that are structural, in addition to just social. There are economic reasons that we don't get balanced, healthy diets under capitalism, and that's a major part of keeping a healthy bodily ecology and keeping a healthy mind.
Mm-hmm.
So he kind of like looks at what are the root causes for these kind of things that we assume to just be kind of structures of the human mind. Yeah.
And I guess just touching on that real quick, there's a thing that Mark Fisher's sometimes criticized for, which is that he uses his depression in a way where he kind of equates it or ties it into the ontology of capitalism itself. And do you find that that's true when it comes to Fisher? Like, he may be, how would I say it?
Reading capitalism through the lens of a depressed person?
Yes.
I guess I could see it, but I think that, it's a fair reading. I think that a lot of, people living on a daily basis in this system do experience those kind of pervasive trends of hopelessness and depression. So I think that to a certain extent, I think that seems like a little uncharitable. Yeah.
I definitely agree. And especially with something like, if you compare his work with something like by Deleuze and Guattari, they're kind of doing a similar thing by kind of ontologizing like schizophrenia in some sense.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, like they, read. I mean, Mark doesn't even necessarily exclusively constrain capitalism within the framework of depression. He also describes it as having bipolar characteristics, as having, intense periods of economic exuberance followed by like literal, we call economic depressions. So there's kind of like this manic depressive trend, not only within ourselves in our trends as consumers, going through these periods of frivolous spending and then, saving and unemployment and things like that, but also in the economy itself. And I think that's, another thing that he definitely inherited from Deleuze and Guattari. I think there's a really good, like Deleuze and Guattari's framework, looking at capitalism through the lens of schizophrenia, I think is valid in a lot of other ways. Like there's a great observation in Society of the Spectacle by Guy Debord, where he kind of observes that, capitalism has schizophrenic qualities in the sense that the car has to market itself against the city. So the car demands, wide open highways. The spectacle of the car demands wide open highways, suburbs, things like that. Whereas the spectacle of the city demands, a robust urban life, a downtown. And these things kind of compete against each other. So they're kind of conflicting, fragmented desires. So I think there are a lot of ways a lot of lenses through which you can look at, modernity and see how modernity manifests as well as kind of reinforces these, trends of mental unwellness or, altered states.
Yeah, it's funny that you mentioned the car example because it reminds me of like car commercials when it's like go on an adventure, I think is like Toyota's tagline. And they tell you to go off-roading and all this stuff, and it's like most people use their cars to commute to work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, like, not to get on a total tangent, but cars have totally shaped American subjectivity in a way that is atomizing and individualizing. Like the suburbs are have no organic communal life, and that's just kind of one of many ways in which commodities shape the world around us in kind of imperceptible ways. Like Austin, the city I live in, is got it's characterized by massive sprawl. Kind of there's a downtown, but it's kind of just a mess.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
it doesn't have any like the flow of traffic isn't organic, for lack of a better term.
I guess that's another kind of good point that I think Mark brings up in like Capitalist Realism and the like, which is that our economy was never really planned. It just kind of organically sprang up. So it's kind of an economy built on momentum, and I guess you could look at it through a lens of ignorance. We didn't really know how any of these things were going to play out, and they kind of all played out according to the dictates of commodification in the market. So we've got a society that's really characterized by all these clashing impulses. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then because I wanted to also bring up that Fisher, what he tends to do is he doesn't seem to forget the libidinal aspect of an economy, right? The fact that economies by and large, they're kind of pushed forward by the desires of the people themselves, and to some extent those desires can be constrained by certain structures within the system itself.
Absolutely. And I think he kind of raises good points in Capitalist Realism, like that there's not really, you can't really say anymore that the bourgeois is at the commanding heights of the economy. It's just kind of an abstract and personal structure of abstract domination at this point that kind of shapes itself according to certain desires, but it can't fulfill other desires that are not kind of dictated by the lens of commodification. So it can't fulfill our desires for a strong social life. It can fulfill our desires for consumption and individualization, but it can't deliver on these kind of things that it has eroded through deterritorialization, like family life, religion, like a robust sense of community, I guess. And I think that was a lot of what led to Marx's kind of persistent depression.
I definitely agree with what you've mentioned. And then I guess real quick, how the process of deterritorialization, as you mentioned, it seems to erode away a lot of these traditional institutions. I think Land calls them the human security system.
Yeah, I like that framework for sure. He has a good analogy, which is that capital is the gunships blowing out the back walls of China, not the back walls, the walls of China. He argues that capitalism just kind of sweeps across the globe like a, I guess, like almost like a pathogen, and that there are these systems that we use to try and constrain them that are ultimately, I guess, in his eyes, futile. And I think that kind of is the essence of his political project, Land's, which is to kind of destroy this human security system and let capital take its natural course.
Yeah, I guess I want to ask you real quick, because I think Fisher struggles with this a bit more than Land does in terms of agency under capitalism. Because to at least to me, it seems that Land doesn't believe in any form of like human agency, insofar as we already are continuing this.
Yeah, I think
Process.
for Land, all of this is entirely out of our hands. The development of technology, really, human beings kind of have no real say in it. Impersonal market forces and the flows of capital are more determining than the actions of any individual capitalist or what have you.
And then how do you think Mark Fisher tries to like resolve some of those issues? Because it seems like he's still working within a more Deleuze and Guattarian framework than even Land, because Land completely seems to abolish the what would you call like the compensatory factors of reterritorialization.
Yeah, I guess I think his philosophy. I don't think they do away with reterritorialization entirely. I think he ignores it. He's kind of coming at Deleuze and Guattari through a creative misreading where he's really focusing on the deterritorializing aspect. But I think Mark, in spite of being very influenced by Deleuze and Guattari and Land, who are all kind of anti-humanist philosophers, Mark definitely retains some of the base humanism that I guess defined early socialism. And he seems to think that I think he has a good analogy, which is that he talks about Land's philosophy as one in which capital is not unmasked as exploited labor power, but instead humans are revealed as the meat puppets of capital. And I mentioned that in Cooper's interview, but he then clarifies that capital can't shed its human face. It's always conditioned by its relationship to human needs. So while it may assume these impersonal, inhuman kind of characteristics, I compared Capital to the Matrix in my interview with Cooper, and in my series, he clarifies that there really isn't capital without human labor. So for him, and this is kind of a critique that you can see kind of from a more economic lens if you read an author like Moishe Postone, who kind of is a late theorist of capital through the lens of time. And I think kind of can be folded neatly into a left accelerationist perspective. Capital always relies on human labor for measuring value, for self-valorization. So in order for capital to develop, it needs the constant input of human labor to extract a surplus. So for Mark and for Postone, you really can't have, like, Land characterizes capital in interviews as auto-autonomizing, meaning that he thinks it's capable of its own self-improvement. But I think that, when you look at the economics of the situation, that's really not the case.
Yeah. I also think that when you look at something like the rise of Web 2.0 with like Facebook and these large social media corporations and the aggregation of data, that kind of seems to, in my opinion at least, it seems to kind of blow his thesis out of the water. But at least to some extent, like you wouldn't, at least if you do have a framework of like pure deterritorialization, at least coming from the 90s.
Something like Facebook doesn't make sense.
Yeah.
I think Facebook and, social media in general is a very interesting phenomena in the sense that it's trying and utterly failing. Like, it's trying to build a kind of sense of community on the internet, but is failing because it's kind of corrupted by these market imperatives that, force it to harvest data from its consumers and just, basically serve as massive advertising platforms. I think this is something that kind of Cernicek and Williams kind of talk about in their manifesto for an accelerationist politics, the kind of like left accelerationist opening salvo, I guess you could call it, which is that, there is potential for a more human scaled social media if it doesn't, exist in the, market imperatives of Twitter and Facebook. Yeah.
To go back to something that you mentioned a little earlier, in regards to how capital always needs to some extent like the validation of like both, I would say, like social, like human interaction to some extent, and then you mentioned like human labor. That almost seems to be, at least to me, that almost sounds quite Heideggerian in the sense that you can't completely remove technology from the social, how would I say it, the social implications that it.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, like, technology, I guess this is like more of like and I think I'm not super familiar with Heidegger, so I don't know if he's coming at it from like an anthropological perspective, but
Mhm.
like, through the lens of anthropology, we would call it embeddedness. Technological relations are still embedded within a wider human framework. They don't, operate entirely independent of our, wants and needs. These technologies, while they may be shaped by desires that are in turn shaped by capitalism, they're still shaped by human desires.
Mm.
Yeah.
Which I think that's tying back again to Marx's whole fascination with like the libidinal aspects of most economies, even something like capitalism, which can't completely get rid of what would you call it, like proletariat desire.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think this is also like a really interesting kind of trend you see when you look at the economy is that, the desires reflected in incredibly cheap consumer goods are really not like, we're seeing luxury goods become much cheaper, whereas necessities are becoming more and more expensive. So the desire is kind of skewed to where the market currently is. So the market expresses a preference for luxury goods rather than necessities. So, there is definitely a power imbalance in the kind of libidinal economy of capitalism itself, where, in the past, you probably could have called them bourgeois desires. Economists like Thorstein Veblen talked about the theory of the leisure class, but leisure has kind of been democratized in the last 100 years. So it's not just, the luxury tastes of the bourgeoisie shaping what is produced, but also our, everyday desires for things to make life more convenient or what have you. But yeah, there is definitely a disconnect between the economy of desire and the economy of needs. Yeah.
Definitely. And I actually want to build up on that because I want to talk about real quick, like Bernie Sanders, just
Sure.
because I mean I feel like it's pretty relevant with the 2020 elections, happening right now,
Mhm.
and I guess how that ties into more of like I wouldn't want to say that Bernie Sanders is like acid communism, although
Yeah.
I did tweet something like that,
I
which
mean, there was this like phenomena of acid Corbynism where like Fisher himself, like kind of these were like a lot of the things that Corbyn was talking about, you know, basic social democratic reforms to kind of they like Fisher viewed these things, the rebuilding of these hollowed out institutions that have been kind of sacked by neoliberalism as a first step in a greater project. The social movements of the 60s and 70s that were so radical and that I think Mayor Pete said last night some incredibly stupid bullshit about. He identified Bernie's desires with like the social movements of the 60s, which is I think absurd because I think most Americans view the 60s as like a period of genuine social progress and transformative change. Um,
even
but
just to touch on that real quick, the even like hardcore like neoconservatives thinks that too, by and large, at least when it comes to like the like libertarian aspects of the 60s, like
yeah,
in hippie communes and stuff like that.
I mean, even with like someone like Martin Luther King, Land in the Dark Enlightenment, he talks about how conservatism basically has to kowtow to these progressive figures and pretend that, whereas like modern conservatives no doubt would have still been fighting MLK tooth and nail, they kind of have to make overtures to that kind of progressive legacy, I guess. But going back to like the concept of, acid Corbynism, Fisher talked a lot about how the rebuilding of like these social democratic institutions, the rebuilding of labor power in the form of unions and whatnot were kind of a necessary first step, because these progressive social movements in the 60s and 70s would not have happened if it weren't for that kind of robust sense of social security that existed under, the government, like the welfare Keynesian consensus. Yeah.
And I guess, do you think, I guess this ties into like the question that I asked earlier about agency, and whether or not, like humans under capitalism have, like either too little or too much agency. Do you think like something like you mentioned about how it seems that like luxuries seem to be getting cheaper and cheaper, but things, for example, I think you mentioned this in Cooper's podcast, where it seems like things like just basic needs like health and like healthcare, and housing and things like that seem to be getting more and more expensive. Mm-hmm. Do you think, like I mentioned, the linkage between socialist movements or socialist reforms with people like candidates like Bernie Sanders, do you think that, how would I say this? Does that help revive certain, like you mentioned, certain, what you could call it, like tones or motifs of the 60s political?
Yeah, I would say so. Like the 60s and 70s were kind of the nadir of the labor movement's power, I think. The reason the economic crisis of the 70s kind of was so bad and played out for so long was that the unions were still powerful when the markets were turning downwards. And I think that, neoliberalism was just one of multiple kind of responses to that crisis. But there were other ones that could have involved the furthering of a socialist project through, cutting the workday and the work week, as opposed to, unevenly distributing work among the kind of flexibilized gig economy that we see now. I think that, the rebuilding of labor is critical to like not only the prospect of, cheaper social services like healthcare and housing, whatnot, things that have been distorted by 50 years of total market dominance, but also towards the, accelerationist project, like I talked about on Cooper's podcast, how the labor movement, an active labor movement, really incentivizes capital to replace labor with machines, because when you have a labor movement fighting for higher pay and less work time, you really put the pressure on capital to kind of deliver, I guess. And I think that's a large part of why you've seen this stalling out. But I think another reason that, these goods are getting so kind of expensive, these necessities, is that, while neoliberalism kind of has this pretense to leanness and efficiency, it really protects a lot of these like entrenched power structures like rent-seeking behavior and the insurance industry, debt collection, things like that, are generally agreed on as market inefficiencies. Like if you look at Adam Smith, he thought rent was an absolute abomination. And like only recently with like Milton Friedman, do you ever see any economist defending rent whatsoever? So, we have these like inefficient structures that we've been taught to believe are natural, like rent and debt, and they're really interfering with the kind of, I guess, economic health, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah. And then do you think that this pressure, I guess, that you mentioned, do you think that almost in a way tends to kind of strive or push capitalism towards full automation?
Absolutely. Yeah. Like, to put it in Marxian terms, Marx talked about surplus value. He talked about absolute and relative surplus value. Absolute surplus value is the time worked by laborers, and relative surplus value is the efficiency of machines putting out. So like, you can put out more goods by having your workers work more time, but you can also put out more goods by making more efficient machines. And when you have a labor movement fighting for less time, you have incentive to roll out machines that are more efficient and can produce to make up for that lost time. So, when you look at like the Industrial Revolution and the last 200 years, things don't really kick off until you start to see active labor movements like, the I think it was like a steam-powered loom was kind of like the first technology that really, set off this like kind of labor resistance. I don't know if it was the Chartists in England who were kind of the first real labor movement, but they kind of saw this automation and were like, they reacted to it kind of with hostility at first, but I think they also realized that these technologies in the long run could free them from the burden of, toil. Yeah.
Do you think more resources should be pushed or concentrated into the efforts of building like real autonomous machines for more complex labor, and instead of what corporations seem to be doing, which is they seem to be automating, but they seem to be automating jobs that, one, are obviously easier to automate, for example, like service jobs, like checkouts, and clerical jobs. That seems to be where the market seems to be focusing more of its efforts than, for example, like even driverless cars.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think with a lot of these things, a lot of automation is being directed towards industries that are, or like commodities that, could be phased out by developing more efficient systems. So it's not even a matter of necessarily needing to automate, instead of having a city that's based around cars, you could have a city that's based around public transport. And I think these things are much easier to automate than, build self-driving cars. It's much easier to have like an automatically run train system, for example. So I think that a lot of, and, you also see automation happening in terms of like military technology. You're getting like autonomous drones and things like that. A lot of, David Graeber points out in his essay on flying cars, it's called, which kind of starts out with a provocative question like, he was born in like the 50s or 60s or something like that, and, was promised flying cars and this, radical futuristic technology. But, in the essay, he points out that 95% of robotics funding is going to the Pentagon. So I think a lot of effort at automation is being misdirected. We could just as easily, automate, a lot of like intellectual labor jobs could be not even automated, but just taken out of existence by creating more efficient administrative forms, so you don't have massive, health insurance bureaucracies and whatnot. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's like, part of the reason that these jobs still exist. And this is another thing that Graeber talks about in Bullshit Jobs, if you've ever read that, or if you're familiar with that at all. So he argues that like, and this is based on like public polling that he did for the book, that like 1/3 of people in the developed world feel that their job contributes nothing to society. And these bullshit jobs are, things like the health insurance industry, which are only preserved because like, when Obama was debating healthcare in 2008, he said, we can't eliminate the insurance industry because that means getting rid of 2 to 3 million jobs. So a lot of these structures are being kept in place because they are important for maintaining the, continued functioning of capitalism, rather than because they're, efficient. And even, yeah, so I think discourse around automation is oftentimes kind of still set by terms of the market. We see a lot of automation happening in like flashy things like Teslas and things like that. But, I think even some of these things are superfluous, or, yeah, misguided use of funds and resources.
Yeah, definitely. Just a real quick tangent. What did you think about Elon Musk's Cybertruck aesthetically?
Gosh, I won't lie, it sucks. Like it's not my style. Like I think when I think like cars of the future, I think more like I don't know, more sleek. Like I guess he really leaned into like a brutalist aesthetic, which is not something I would have pegged him for.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
David, do you have any comments on the Cybertruck?
I think that thing's hideous.
It reminds me of I think I saw a Twitter thread about it, about how the Cybertruck just seems to be buying into what Mark Fisher called the slow cancellation of the futures, and to some extent how that sense of like nostalgia that you mentioned earlier, like it happens with music, but in a sense that it's also happening with like aesthetics, like cyberpunk itself, which is like,
Yeah, the Cybertruck just looks like it's a lot less Jetsons and a lot more like Terminator. It doesn't look like future I want to live in. I'll say that much. Yeah.
it looks like a it looks like a nostalgia for a future that in a way it already happened, right? Or at least it happened in like popular culture or like media.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. And I mean, like, I think that's, kind of another, yeah, that's another, I guess, like really important point of Marx is that like, and Graeber has a really great quote about this as well, which is like, he talks about the CGI they use in Star Wars, and, a lot of the kind of advancements we've seen in technology, he says, are like in, digital and medical technologies. They're technologies of simulation, he calls them. So like, he remembers going to see one of the new Star Wars and thinking, wow, the CGI is really impressive. I bet people in the past would be really impressed by this. And then he thinks, wait a second, they thought that we'd actually be we'd be in space by now, colonizing the stars and whatnot. And I think even that, you can debate whether or not that's a realistic vision for a future society. I think, it's just as likely that we tend in the direction of singularity rather than like expansion. But yeah, I think, there are a lot of kind of aesthetic appeals to futurity that are kind of like used to cover up fundamentally unfuturistic technologies. Yeah, like the Cybertruck is a perfect example of that. It's an aesthetic of futurity applied to a profoundly regressive technology.
Definitely. Yeah. Especially with,
I'm glad we could tie up the cars.
Yeah.
When I brought that up, I didn't feel like.
Yeah. You bring up a really good point, because I feel like people think, oh, and I'm really guilty of this too. So I wouldn't say like just people in general, but thinking like lithium batteries are like this futuristic thing, and it's like our battery technology really hasn't changed since basically we kind of made what would you call them, the lithium cells more compact in cell phones. Cell phone lithium battery technology seems to be even more advanced than basically the whole Tesla car, which is just basically motors running on traditional lithium batteries.
Like lithium batteries like stapled together on the bottom of a car. It doesn't seem, profoundly like. I think a lot of that is because of, and I think this is one of the prime areas that the left like really fucked up hard, but kind of our stigmatization of nuclear energy, is really interfering with our ability to kind of deliver on our promises of green energy and things like that. Nuclear energy might be, it's been tarnished by things like Chernobyl, but there are ways to make it safer. And the reason that things like Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island happened were not the result of the technology failing, but a result of, government cutbacks not springing for the technology that could have prevented those kinds of things. So I think we're kind of leaning into this like solar panel, wind power kind of vision of a future economy, but that's still another kind of inefficient industry that is very extractive and, not entirely futuristic, really. Yeah.
Yeah. To me, this is kind of like a personal pet peeve of mine when people bring up like green capitalism. I'm like, sure, but that just seems to me like the biggest contradiction, at least in terms of like just basically on my physics 101 understanding of entropy, that just seems to be like, that's not really how it works. You're always going to lose some of the energy inputs that you're receiving no matter what. So it doesn't matter how efficient you make those, those wind turbines. You're always not going to generate the energy that you need. And then especially with the demand of energy consumption in the United States, you're never going to supplement that, at least until the technology gets super good. And at that time, we're probably going to be all dead, and all the all the greenhouse gases are gonna be
And I mean,
used
like,
up.
I don't think Land has any illusions that, there's such a thing as green capitalism. When he talks about, technological futures, he kind of like makes fun of the left for having this like humanist attachment to the earth itself. Like he has this essay called A Critique of Transcendental Miserabilism, where he like kind of critiques this, this almost like depressive trend on the left, like going back to what we talked to about Mark and his work. He kind of criticizes the left for being like stuck in this like area of complete despair about the future of capitalism and climate change and whatnot, and really unable to orient itself to any positive solutions. And I think that's where things like left accelerationism come in. It's a matter of kind of reclaiming the future. Yeah.
And do you think then that should be kind of both the position that like a left accelerationist and then by extension like a acid communist should take, and then kind of tying that into like aesthetics? It seems that the left completely has lost the ability to, for lack of a better term, meme compared to the right.
Yeah.
And it's just like the dissolution of any coherent aesthetic, at least from the left, seems to have severely crippled it.
Yeah, I this is kind of like, I guess, coming from a libertarian socialist, I guess, like anarchist bent when I first got into the leftism. I kind of think that, Marxism has really oriented itself around critique for the last 200 years. And, it just is a progressive strengthening and deepening of critique, but it really has no positive content. And I think that's where something like anarchism can make up for it and kind of deliver the kind of like utopianism that the left has lost sight of, I guess. Marx kind of like dismissed the term utopianism because he had this vision of socialism as a, scientific process, and kind of rejected what he saw as the, I guess, retreat from society by like utopian socialists. But I think that it's important to, in addition to, having strong critiques of the current system, envision a future.
Yeah, definitely.
There's a great quote from like Alan Moore, the guy who did Watchmen and whatnot, which is that like if you don't imagine a future, there's a good chance you won't have one. And I think that speaks to like not only like a social future, but even an individual future. Like I think that like depression can very easily set in if you can't see a way out. And I think that kind of must have been what Mark dealt with in his later years. Just like this oppressive atmosphere of capitalist realism really weighed on him in a way that he felt he couldn't really overcome. Yeah.
Yeah. Did you by any chance, have you taken a look at Mark Fisher's The Weird and the Eerie?
I have not, no.
Okay.
Yeah, I guess I skew more towards like I definitely am interested in some of his cultural stuff, but the economics of the critique is usually what I'm interested in. Yeah.
Okay. I was just gonna mention the connections between like The Weird and the Eerie and like the possibility of like new futures. But I guess we won't. We don't.
Well,
really
I mean, like, yeah, I mean, what is he kind of like? Is he looking at specific pieces of culture in that, or
no?
Yeah.
Well, yes, because it's Mark Fisher, and he always seems to tie it to some cultural artifact.
Yeah, for sure. Mm-hmm.
But then he ties it into kind of like the aesthetics. He kind of calls them two ontological modes, which is like the weird, and then the eerie, which is the eerie is like the absence or the presence of something that shouldn't be there. I kind of forget what he mentions the weird is, but you can kind of equate it to seeing something where it shouldn't, or something that exists that shouldn't exist.
Mm-hmm.
Kind of like seeing a UFO would be kind of weird.
Yeah.
And then in a lot of ways, you can definitely tie those themes of the weird and the eerie to something like acid communism, at least in my opinion, because it's like, by all means and purposes, something like capitalist realism. If you take it as a let's say a true ontological framework, then something like socialism or communism
seems otherworldly almost. Yeah.
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 So
I guess that's where Posadism must have come out of. If you're familiar with Jay Posadas.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah. Me and David meme a lot about Posadism or
Yeah.
Posadism.
And I think that this is another thing I'm working on for the series that I'm currently doing, which is I think Posadism's or Posadis, he had some very out there ideas, like the idea that nuking Earth was a good idea. But I also think so one of the videos I'm working on is a serious examination of his proposition that if aliens exist, they have to be communist, because I think, the kind of reality of global warming is demonstrating that, we are not going to be able to kind of make it into the stars in time to save ourselves from planetary ecological collapse. So if there are societies out there that survive that kind of cataclysm, then they most likely had to do it through developing the kind of ecological and social sustainability that I think only socialism can deliver on. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I think that's a really good point, actually, because I think even Nick Land touches on this, and I think that's either his lecture or his interview about teleoplexy, where he talks about, someone asks him something about the politics of the future, and he mentions how some people think it's I think he mentions the Soviets had a real true vision of what the future could look like, and they definitely did. It's a futurist, like Soviet aesthetic.
Yeah,
and
for sure.
They had a clear vision of what that would look like, especially with things like the space program that they had competing with the United States. And I think it's funny that even Land, as far right as he tends to lean now, I mean, he said he's not convinced about something like that, but it's funny that he still brings something up, like the possibility of, like, let's say we do discover alien life. I'm not too certain about that, but in the case that we do, it would completely, again, almost completely throw out his thesis about overextending the capitalist process to even at a cosmological scale. Or
and I guess that's another kind of if there is a massive universe spanning, or the potential of a universe spanning capitalist society, why haven't they invaded Earth and stolen all our resources yet? I mean, that's what a capitalist society does. It's constantly oriented towards the outside and towards new frontiers that it can exploit. So if there was the possibility of capitalism in space, I think it would have happened by now. And I think Fisher kind of like talks about this when he talks about WALL-E. He kind of views WALL-E as a model of the limits of I guess ecological capitalism. Yeah. He kind of throws it out there as an example of how capitalism is really constrained by these environmental factors, and it can't just slough off the earth like a kind of used carcass. It relies on the constant input of new resources to continue expanding, and you can't have a capitalism that is not constantly appropriating new resources. I think that's why we're seeing a lot of the economic stagnation we see today, is because these new frontiers like India and China and Africa, which were incorporated in like the late 19th, early 20th century, they're becoming developed, and they're really there's only so much we can extract from those parts of the world without, I guess, it catching up to us.
Yeah. And then I guess just moving on real quick, you are working on a series. I want to talk real quick about your personal works. You're working on a new YouTube series. Briefly, can you tell us what YouTube channel?
So it'll be called UtopiaTv. Currently, nothing up there right now. I'm actually just now starting the episode on Nick Land, The Matrix, and Intelligent Capital. But it'll, I guess the core thrust of it will be an exploration of the breaking down, kind of like from a hermeneutical perspective, each sect of the left, what they're talking about, it's kind of a history of leftism from, the French Revolution to Proudhon to Marx to the modern day. And it's not really attempting to caricaturize any of those, like even when it comes to out there philosophies like Posadism and anarcho-primitivism and whatnot. I'm really trying to get to the bottom of what they're talking about, what their critiques are about, and how they can play into building a more robust kind of unified narrative. Yeah.
Definitely.
But I guess the ones I'm really excited about are the ones where I get to, just talk about one author and one work, like Nick Land in the Matrix, or yeah.
What other ones do you have in the series, if you don't mind me asking?
So I mean, I currently, like, for the first season, I'm doing like a couple episodes that'll be like about Posadism, about anarcho-capitalism, and why it doesn't fit in the anarchist framework. The history of anti-fascism. I'm also doing one on Buddhism and socialism, kind of comparing the metaphysics of the Buddhist system to like the entire history of Western metaphysics. Like, I think that in many ways, Buddhism kind of preempted the metaphysical frameworks of like Hume, Kant, Deleuze, and in a lot of ways, we've just been catching up to things that they figured out 2,000 years ago. But I'm also doing, a series on pop culture. So there'll be one on, capitalism and schizophrenia through the lens of the Netflix series Maniac. In the future, I want to do one comparing the visions of, the bourgeoisie through the show Billions versus like through the show, what's it called? Succession, because I think they present two very kind of differing stories about, the modern capitalism. Billions posits a omnipotent capitalist who's like brilliant, and Succession just kind of shows these people as completely, vain idiots who have no actual control over the mechanisms of power. So yeah, it's just a kind of exploration of philosophy, politics, and history through the lens of pop culture, because I have always been definitely addicted to that kind of stuff. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely. What other do you have any other projects you're currently working on?
I guess, yeah. So when I first started reading all this stuff, when I first got into left-wing politics, I started writing a book, writing notes really that eventually kind of have slowly turned into a book. And it's like somewhere like 300 pages so far with like no end in sight. So I think that the YouTube series I'm working on, UtopiaTv, is really an effort to put that into, like, because the book will probably end up being somewhere like 12,000 or 1,200 pages long. So to put that into kind of processable,
like bite-sized chunks, or
exactly, because like no one really has the time, if they're not a serious academic, to devour a 1,000-page book. Yeah. But the book I'm working on kind of looks at capital in the age of ecological limits imposed by climate change, and kind of is more economic-y. Yeah, it's kind of jargonful, I guess. Yeah.
Definitely. So we are coming up on an hour. I don't want to take up too much of your time, but I do want to ask you one, I guess like a couple more questions, just real quick. One of them would be in terms of the left, like a candidate like Bernie Sanders, if they were to be, they were to win the primaries, for example, and then go up toe to toe with Trump. First question, do you think he could win? And then the follow-up question would be, if he doesn't, what do you think that would mean for like a revival of the socialist movement?
Yeah, I think that, like if you look at head-to-head polling, I think Bernie has the best prospects against Trump. I think that, there will probably be more efforts to sabotage him, whether that be like a brokered convention or like a third-party run from someone like Bloomberg. But I think that if it's just a head-to-head between Bernie and Trump, I think Bernie likely wins. I don't know, how much he can. I think the power of the presidency has definitely like grown exponentially since like the founding of the United States. So I think that he could get a lot done. But I think if he loses, that definitely poses interesting questions about whether the socialist left has a future in the Democratic Party, which I think the answer is probably no. But I think if he wins, there's a significant chance that he could transform those old sclerotic institutions into something more workable. Yeah.
Awesome.
For sure.
And then, yeah, do you have any final comments or anything that you want to add real quick, just in general, or any last points of discussion?
Yeah, I guess I think that kind of bringing it back to, you know, the concept of accelerationism, I think that uh, a lot of the change that needs to happen will kind of require a revitalization of basic working class politics. You know, there is a limited amount of time to get this all done, but I think that in order to have a springboard off which to build any kind of alternative left wing project, you really have to start clawing back some of the things that neoliberalism has kind of uh, taken away from us. Yeah. And I think there is a lot of potential, not only in automation, but in terms of just quality of life, in terms of reducing the working day for a socialist left project to appeal to people on an everyday basis and to kind of create that richer culture that, you know, Mark talked about, that you know, to build genuine institutions of collective solidarity. Yeah.
Definitely. I guess you made me think of another question.
Sure.
Do you think?
I do have time. Yeah.
Yeah. Do you think something like what would you call the like religion? Do you think that has a place to be revitalized? For example, on something like the socialist or the leftist project.
Yeah, I do think so, actually. I mean, like, I think that there has to be a certain acceptance that, you know, you can't really be a Catholic fighting against abortion on the left. It's like not, you know, like sustainable position for you. You won't be likely to find any kind of like, you know, I listened to your interview with Justin Murphy. I don't think you're likely to find any purchase as a leftist opposed to abortion. And I think that it's important to kind of like stick to our principles as far as that goes. But I think if you look at, you know, the remaining kind of strong social institutions that exist in the developed world are often religious ones. Like they have, you know, organic networks of mutual aid and whatnot, charity, even though charity is not always the ideal solution for these things. Like there are resources that the, I guess, religious movement can marshal. And I think that there are potent, you know, critiques that can be made that combine left wing and religious thought. Yeah,
Definitely.
absolutely.
And then you brought up Justin Murphy, and like I don't want to give him, I don't want to not give him credit because I think he does certain things that I mean I find pretty interesting.
I think his whole, you know, vision of I guess exit from academia is really inspiring for me personally. I think that I guess it has kind of like given me a little bit of the push I need to make my own exit, I guess. I think that, you know, he's kind of like given like a platform to some real dumbasses like Claire Lehman and stuff like that. But I also think he's kind of, I don't think this is what Gramsci intended, but he's kind of fulfilling that role that Gramsci talked about the organic intellectual, about kind of like a kind of working class intellectual, unrooted from the kind of sclerotic and bureaucratic institutions of academia.
Yeah.
I think that there's a lot to be said for what he's doing. Yeah.
Yeah. I briefly mentioned in the podcast that I think like right at the beginning I'm like I think what the way I see him, he's deterritorializing certain aspects of academia, kind of like opening up this little hole for everyone else. I think the thing that he struggles with is like his delivery on some things.
Yeah.
And I think that's just the nature of his character. Like, I
think part of it is like, you know, he's being provocative. He's definitely like trolling like that in certain aspects. Like he's, you know, I guess pushing the envelope. And I think even like his academic research is like not even necessarily, you know, Base Deleuze is a very provocative kind of framing of reading of Deleuze's, I guess, body of work.
Mm-hmm.
I think that it's hard to tell for me where he's being genuine and where he's like fucking with us.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think I asked him this on the interview. I was like, are you serious about some of the things that he tweeted? And he's like, I'm always genuine. And I'm like, I think what he means is he's always genuine about trolling.
Yeah, exactly.
If that makes sense.
He's committed. Yeah.
Yeah, but yeah. Did you happen to read Base Deleuze?
I haven't. No, I've listened to a couple of his podcasts about it and his like roundtable that he did on Theory Talk. I feel like I've been attacking Deleuze, especially for the thing I'm working on, from the kind of like psychoanalytical lens. So I've been very specifically trying to learn as much as I can about that. I have not gotten around to Base Deleuze though. No.
I think you should definitely read, even if people think that it's like not that great. Just because even if it's not like academically rigorous, I think it still does something that's pretty cool, which is like it reterritorializes a lot of Deleuze's own ideas.
Yeah, I can see
if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And kind of when he says like the reactionary leftism of Deleuze, I'm like, that's just reading Deleuze from like a reactionary framework.
I mean, Deleuze does I think get a lot of his influence from Nietzsche. You could definitely pin as a reactionary. I like that. There's a good quote Mark Fisher has, which is that like Nietzsche has this baiting of progressive tendencies that I think you see in like Deleuze, Land, and I guess even Justin Murphy to an extent. He's like challenging a lot of what I think are kind of, and this is like something Cernacek and Williams talk about when they talk about folk politics as like a kind of model for the modern left, as very centered on a moral critique of capitalism, which I think is a dead end. If you want to mount any substantial challenge to capitalism, you have to think strategically, and I think that the folk left or folk political left has very much reacted to kind of capitalism rather than done anything legitimate to
go
scare
against
it. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm actually kind of glad that you brought up what you mentioned earlier, like this Justin Murphy's like exit from academia, and kind of tying it back to you, your exit from academia. It seems to be that right now, and again, I'm saying like it seems to be. I'm not sure if this is actually the case, but it seems to be that more and more people are actually able to be kind of like online intellectuals, if that makes sense.
I mean, I'm supporting myself through like part-time work, and I think that really, if you want to research certain things like philosophy and so any capitalist politics, no one's going to pay you to do that really anymore. Academia is so competitive. Like what the program I was in was a professional program training analysts, economists, things like that, and I don't think it was really putting me in any position to challenge capitalism or to build alternatives or anything. I think it was training me to be a bureaucrat. And as interesting as some of the classes were, I just like thought about working 40 hours a week for a state agency or something like that, and it made me want to blow my fucking brains out. So I think there's a lot to be said about teaching yourself, about autodidacts. I think Fisher was in many respects an autodidact. I think that if you want to learn something that's like outside of the STEM fields, you can pretty much do it outside of universities these days. Like I wouldn't want a doctor to operate on me if he's self-taught, but pretty much philosophy, economic statistics, you can teach yourself all of those things. Absolutely.
Yeah. I think bringing up even like Spinoza's example, I mean, he didn't have any like proper philosophical training, at least to some extent, and he's even like a really good, I mean, he was doing that stuff in the 1600s, so
yeah,
I mean, even now with I guess like the technological capabilities that we have or resources, it's a lot easier for people, at least the average person, to kind of get their ideas out. Whether they're
For sure.
substantial, it's, whatever. But
I think, the next step, though, is figuring out how to mobilize, capital in order to kind of have money on the left to mount these, like Cernacek and Williams talk about how it's necessary to have, in addition to just like these intellectual resources, that start accruing physical resources, whether that be capital or what have you, to kind of start navigating a left accelerationism, navigating accelerationism away from its, myopic, self-destructive tendencies, I guess, towards a, you can't just disavow money yet. That's kind of, I guess, you would call it ultra-leftism on the left. It's idealism, I suppose.
I'm glad you brought up the money thing, actually, because I think even to some extent, I don't want to like connect it too much because I know Land would hate this, but it seems to be like that's something even Land talks about in like cryptocurrent, like the importance of like Bitcoin.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I really like that kind of conversation, the back and forth that he and Murphy had, where Murphy was talking about, left-wing patches in a, blockchain-based currency system. I think that, Marx talked about labor vouchers as an alternative to money, where, you work, you use the labor vouchers to pay for commodities. Commodities are not paid for using wages, because that kind of leads to this dynamic of inflation that has been kind of a progressive plague for like a consistent question in economics. So you could use something like blockchain to create a labor voucher system where, you work, you spend the labor voucher, instead of becoming tradable money, it's destroyed. You could use blockchain to create a system like that is more geared towards a left-wing project, in which, could be used for, democratic economic planning on a community basis. So say you have like a local bank issuing a community-based currency, then you can plan where labor goes in that community and use a blockchain-based currency to, essentially do a decentralized, planned socialist economy. Yeah.
That I think you brought this up actually in what's his name's Cooper Machinic what is it called? Machinic
Desire. On Cooper's podcast. Yeah.
Yeah, Cooper's. You bring that up, the Cyverson, I think.
Oh, Cybersign. Yeah.
Cybersign.
Yeah, that was a Chilean project designed by this guy Stafford Beard, which kind of like, it was far more centralized, and I think is ideal in doing any kind of economic planning. I think you want it to be more networked than centralized, and that's what made it so easy to topple and destroy. When Pinochet came in, you could just like go to the central offices of Cybersign and destroy it. But I think that was an early example of that kind of
like alternative to
exactly, yeah,
like, even what would you call it, like money, because the primary function of money is pretty much just accounting. Like
blockchain does solve a lot of the problems that come with the accounting. It's a system to automate kind of double entry bookkeeping, which two companies could use to like square their accounts. It kind of removes the need for an arbiter, I guess.
Yeah.
Like a central bank or something like that.
Yeah.
And it's ironic that Land has pivoted towards this hyper-capitalist right-wing framework, because his early work was so oriented towards these like systems which would decentralize and dissolve centralized power. So it's interesting to see him go in the complete opposite direction in the last 20 years or so.
Yeah. I think MetaNomad brought this up in the last podcast I did. How this seems,
I'm interested to hear that one. Yeah.
He brings up the example about how land seems to be kind of taking a completely, well, not completely different, but a tangential, like, what do you call it, framework for a lot of his work now, especially with something like, even Land mentions this, the transcendental deduction of money itself, which just seems kind of weird. I don't know. What do you think particularly about Land's trajectory and his way of thinking from the 90s, like CCRU stuff? And then
I think, there are definitely, like, it's easy to see for me, having read The Dark Enlightenment and his earlier stuff, how that kind of developed. His philosophy was always very anti-humanist. He was interested in what human life would look like after humanity, as it were, was, unrecognizable. And I think that's where, he gets into a lot of this stuff about like eugenics and stuff like that. He's kind of looking at the current distribution of social power and the way that race relations are reified in modern society. And he thinks that, these technologies of gene editing and stuff like that are coming into existence at a massively unequal time in our history, and that, they will be distributed unevenly. So I think that's where like some of the weird race stuff comes in. As for the economics of it, it just seems profoundly misguided to me, because I think if you look at, what's blocking the accelerative tendency, I think 9 times out of 10, it's not a political thing, it's a capitalism thing. Mm-hmm. This, kind of postone thesis that I brought up about how labor is a vital part of, I guess this is more the autonomous Marxist school, that labor is a vital part of, driving forward acceleration. I don't think you can have capitalism without labor. And I think that's kind of what he is leaning towards, I guess. Yeah. For me, I feel like there is no potential for an accelerationist project without
human
a left,
labor,
I guess.
Or a left. What exactly, like a humanist left, like
not necessarily. I mean, like, I think in our, I guess, preliminary conversation, I brought up the example of San Junipero. Have you seen that Black Mirror episode?
Yeah, it's a really good episode.
It's like a digital, I think it could be a very utopian but entirely non-humanist future, where it's basically a digital playground almost. This laborless future could be, it doesn't necessitate us existing, and it could incorporate these kind of techno-utopian visions that like Land talks about, or someone like Ray Kurzweil talks about. It doesn't necessarily have to be centered on human life. And I think that's, I guess, where like human life as it currently exists, our social life as it currently exists, and I think that's where a lot of the left gets stuck, is like trying to rewind time to a period where there was, an organic communal life. I think we have to create a new communal life that might not look exactly like, our model of like socialism, where everyone, Soviet communism, or, Proudhonian socialism, or anything like that. I think it's a matter of, I guess, I think, Cernicek and Williams' book title sums it up perfectly, Inventing a Future. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Well, Jack, I do have to go pretty soon, just because I am running out of time here at I rent out the place that I
Fair enough. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But I do want to just ask you real quick again. Do you have any like final thoughts or any things that we didn't get to in the podcast? I know that I did mention we did want to cite it more towards pop culture, but I thought the way the conversation was going was
fair. Yeah, I think that the left can't shy away from embracing technology as a site of struggle. I think that has definitely happened. It's kind of become more of a critique of distribution than a critique of production, and I think that it's well past time to look not only at how goods are, produced unevenly and distributed unevenly, but also, or distributed unevenly, but to look at how our entire productive apparatus could be changed to, enable maximal human emancipation through increasing free time, through automation, through, you know, uh, social planning, through these, technologies that we've kind of shied away from as viewing them as inherently capitalist. I think that there's a lot of potential there.
Yeah, definitely. I want to bring up real quick. I think that a lot of the way that this could work is by like, I'm gonna say something that might sound a little cringe, but like mobilizing like accelerationists. Not like in the sense of like, what would you say, like theoretically, because I don't think accelerationism has like praxis. I think that's kind of, at least for me personally, I think it's a little bit like misguided. But I think if it were to have an implementation of praxis, I think a lot of like accelerationists are kind of scared to embrace certain like leftist tendencies. And I think like that's the opposite of what they should be worrying about. I think if anything, leftist projects seem to be, I guess if you take...
I definitely agree with that. I think, like, if you look at the right accelerationist model of an accelerationist praxis, like Land is talking about how great he thinks Bloomberg is. So I don't think there's a very promising future where Michael Bloomberg is president.
Yeah.
I think that. Yeah.
Yeah. No. I guess real quick again, backtracking to Nick Land. What do you think about some of the things that he says on his Twitter? Because it seems to be like he's just shitposting a lot.
It's so hard to tell. I mean, like it's like another situation with Justin Murphy. Like he might just be playing the heel to a certain extent. I think what's so interesting about the Dark Enlightenment is that it's really a pure distilled antithesis of socialism. The objective is still maximal human liberty, or I guess maximal, not even necessarily human, but maximal liberty and emancipation, but the means are the exact opposite. Instead of abolishing the state and class society, it's a rigid class structure, a state which is omnipotent, basically. I think he's almost creating an antithesis. Like, it's hard to tell. Yeah.
I definitely get what you're saying. Like he seems to be like the perfect. You keep saying like an antithetical project. Like the Dark Enlightenment seems to be like an antithesis to the current.
I mean, this is something that Mark Fisher says in Terminator versus Avatar, which is that Nick Land is the kind of antagonist the left needs.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that sums it up perfectly. His early philosophy called the left on failing to deliver on technological emancipation. I think his current philosophy calls the left on its unwillingness to deal with the realities of sovereign power. I think that he is the antagonist we need right now.
Yeah. Meta does mention, and not just in my podcast, I think he mentions it, I forgot who he interviewed, but he mentions how Land is kind of like doing transcendental exit, and he's more, at least in some respects, he's more of an anarchist, and I think I prefer reading Land on that frame than what
Absolutely.
most people...
I mean, like, I think his early work, there's almost nothing. I mean, excluding the fact that the framework of technological liberation is inherited from Marx, he was always more of an anarchist.
Mm.
Yeah.
And then, because I want to ask this question about Land's racism, because I asked Meta this, like if Land, how I don't think Land is racist, but not... I didn't word the question right, because I don't think he's a racist in the same way like Donald Trump, quote unquote, could be considered a racist, but he is a racist.
He definitely is. Like, I think what's really interesting about the Dark Enlightenment is that while I think the diagnosis is wrong, in regards to what is blocking acceleration in the long run, it's a really good analysis of like how representative democracy has failed and turned into kind of like institutionalized grift and bureaucracy and appropriation into like different coalitions. And it's also a really good analysis of how race relations move from socially constructed to like very real, tangible aspects of a society, I guess. yeah, I think that he is still pretty wrong about a lot of stuff, but yeah, it's hard to tell whether he's genuine or not.
Did you catch any of the debate quote unquote with Reza Negrestani?
I didn't. They seem to be talking mostly about ontology, right?
Yeah,
was that
mostly ontology. I mean, it's just because Reza's all of his what would you call it, like metaphysics is completely, at least in my opinion, like adverse to lands, but they seem to, I feel like they should agree on a lot of things, but at the same time they disagree on a lot of things, like at least notions of time.
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with Reza's stuff. Like, what is the basic gist of his ontology, would you say?
He kind of returns to Hegel, but instead of doing like
I could see why Land would hate that.
Yeah, instead of doing the whole dialectics, it seems to be he replaces Hegelian dialectics with what would you call complexity theory or complex theory.
Interesting.
So it's still,
I think, it's interesting to like see how Hegel kind of infiltrates some of like Land's thinking. Even like he talks about, I think in his interview with either Justin or Metanomad, how like capital is kind of, I would compare capital to the world historical subject of like Hegel's philosophy to the Geist, in that it's like capital that is coming to know itself, coming to increased levels of rationalization and self-knowledge and understanding about the world rather than the human subject. So I think in that respect, Land's kind of a Hegelian. He'd probably hate that, but yeah.
Yeah, no, he's probably like his Hegel senses are tingling, someone used his name in the same sentence, but yeah. Well, Jack, I'm gonna have to let you go here soon, but do you have any final comments or anything that you like? Again, I know I said this for like the 5th time now, but do you have anything that you'd want to add, or where we could find you on social media or anything like that?
Yeah, I'm on Twitter at technoecologic, I guess. I don't know when you're planning to release it. Have you released the Metanomad episode?
I did. I just recently, I think a Monday, 2 days ago. Gotcha. So it's brand new. So yeah.
So yeah, I mean, about the time that maybe this is coming out, I might have something up finally on my YouTube channel, which is UtopiaTv, and is on YouTube at UtopiaTv YouTube, or on Twitter at UtopiaTV YouTube. Hopefully I'll have at least a teaser up. I kind of want to throw up the Nick Land episode as soon as I can, but I was happy to talk to you about it, and thanks for having me on.
Yeah, no problem. But alrighty, Jack, I'll let you go then, but thanks so much for coming on the show, taking the time.
All right, good talking to you, Corn.
Have a good one.
Peace.
Alrighty, guys. Well, again, thank you so much. Please like, share, and subscribe. If you have any suggestions for the next show, please share them with me on Twitter at Pop with Corn, and that's _ capital Pop, lowercase w, capitalized CORN, Corn. And as always, thanks for listening.
When you come out, your shit is gone. When you come out, your shit is gone. When you come out, your shit is gone. You'll catch a JPEG to their head. Uber Reach, you're an intern, a wiki mix. Most loved, therefore most hated. Come and knock on the door, we've been waiting for you. Game changer, reclusive aggressive. Yin and yang, you know it. Info warrior, check a hacker. The Rolling Stoner, prophet of disaster. My existence is a momentary lapse of reason. Got the DNA of Gothic lemon, shredded 13 times out of 11. Your bad ideas are the ATM. Shed my skin. Leave it for the homeless and sleeping. Prodigal, fuck that nautical. Teaching bitches how to swim. I'm in your area. I'm in your area. I'm in your area. I'm in your area. I know the first to know. I'm in Teaching bitches how to swim. Teaching bitches how to swim. Teaching bitches how to swim. Yeah. The table's flipped, now we got all the coconuts, bitch. Burn me, these babies underneath y'all. Screaming beautiful songs. The cray, ultra contrary on. Having conversations with your car lawn.